The Great Migration of over 6 million people leaving southern states for destinations in other parts of the United States had a major impact on the demographics of the entire country. The movement culminated with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Provisions of this Civil Rights Act forbade discrimination based on sex as well as race in hiring, promoting, and firing. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the nation's benchmark civil rights legislation, and it continues to resonate in America. Passage of the act ended the application of Jim Crow laws, which had been upheld by the Supreme Court in the 1896 case Plessy v. Ferguson, in which the court held that racial segregation purported to be separate but equal was constitutional. The Civil Rights Act was eventually expanded by Congress to strengthen enforcement of these fundamental civil rights. According to the U.S. Census survey in 1900, the average salary in the United States for most men was $449.80, or $8,973 in year $2000. For an African American male, the average annual salary was $150, or $2,992 in year $2000, or about one-third that of a white laborer for the same work. Despite advances in civil rights, the average median weekly earnings for white workers 16 years and over in the United States in 2022 is $1,068, while the average for Black or African American workers 16 years and older is $885. One of the areas that was most affected by the migration was the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Quoting from the African American Heritage Trail, Washington, D.C., by Marvin McQuitter, Ph.D., African Americans have been a significant part of Washington, D.C.'s civic life and identity since the city was first declared the new national capital in 1791. African Americans were 25% of the population in 1800, and the majority of them were enslaved. By 1830, however, most were free people. By 1900, Washington had the largest percentage of African Americans of any city in the nation. Many came because of opportunities for federal jobs. Others were attracted to the myriad educational institutions. Howard University, founded in 1867, was a magnet for professors and students and would become the capstone of Negro education by 1930. Washington, D.C. became a destination for many African Americans during the Great Migration, and the Great Migration is among the stories told at the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Quoting from a National Public Radio article entitled, "When Blacks Fled the South, D.C. became home for many from North Carolina." The greatest migration came right around World War II. The 1940s and 1950s is when you get the largest percentage of African Americans coming to the city, and in 1957 is when African Americans were a majority in this city and became the first Black majority big city in the country, says Myra McWhirter, a historian who helped create the African American Heritage Trail, which winds through a number of D.C. neighborhoods and tells the history of important Black residents and institutions. It is important when doing research about the Great Migration to cast a wide net for sources and repositories. One of these repositories is the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which has an impressive collection of memorabilia and artifacts. When I visited the museum, I was impressed by the depth and detail of the exhibits. One interesting collection is the Great Migration Home Movie Project, quoting from the website. In addition to the Great Migration, the National Museum of African American History and Culture has collected and preserved a number of African American home movies from both known and unknown families. While major motion picture film and television historically lacked diverse representation, Black history was instinctively being preserved by everyday home movies. Today, these personal narratives serve as an invaluable tool for understanding and reframing Black moving image history and provide a much-needed visualization of African American history and culture. One common occurrence that helps research into the migrants' or immigrants' lives is that they tend to settle in areas where there are people who are related or at least speak the same language. Focusing on this related cluster enables a researcher to have a larger base of information to use to work through the barriers of time and distance from the places of origin. One interesting book about the migration to Washington, D.C. is by Margot Lee Shetterly and Winifred Conkling, called Hidden Figures: The True Story of 4 Black Women and the Space Race. Although the book is primarily about the 4 women, there is a lot of explanation about the establishment of the African American migrant community southwest of Washington, D.C. Whenever we begin genealogical research about a migrant or an immigrant, discovering the place of origin of the migrant or immigrant often becomes the ultimate end of the line or brick wall. Over the years, as I have helped people with their genealogical research, the most common obstacle to overcome has always been the origin of the migrant or immigrant. There is no firm beginning date for the Great Migration. Movement of African Americans from the South began in colonial times. Before and during the American Civil War, a loosely organized effort called the Underground Railroad, also called the Abolitionist Underground, helped enslaved people to escape to the northern free states. When slavery was abolished, there were a few short years when the condition of the former enslaved people improved, but with the passage of systematically oppressive laws called Jim Crow laws, these laws and the efforts to enforce them made unbearable living conditions for nearly all the formerly enslaved people. Unless you have studied this period of American history, you cannot imagine the degree of poverty and suffering that existed in the Black population of the southern states. The first substantial movement of African Americans from the South began just before World War I, beginning in about 1917. The huge influx of men into the armed forces created a work shortage that enabled many African Americans to move from their farms into industrial jobs. The second great surge occurred for the same reason, as World War II was starting in about 1940. This dramatic movement of the formerly enslaved people continues to have a tremendous social, cultural, and political impact on the entire population of the United States. The effect of the movement of over 6 million people within the United States because of systematic discrimination should not and cannot be ignored by genealogists. One relatively recent addition to the record sources available to help with the Great Migration research is the 1950 U.S. Census. This census contains people who came north before and during World War II. This valuable resource was released in April 2022, and many of the major genealogy programs presently have searchable copies of the records. Each of the videos in this 6-part series illustrates an example of researching a family with formerly enslaved ancestors working backward in time, starting with the entry in the 1950s U.S. Census. This segment starts with a family from Washington, D.C. According to the 1950 U.S. Census record from Ancestry.com, Sam Buckner was born in about 1920 in South Carolina. He's married to Rose, who was born in South Carolina in 1908. He is employed as an electric type helper in the U.S. government printing office. The job description refers to the process of electrotyping and printing. Electrotyping was used to make copper reproductions of engraved metal plates or wooden carvings, which were used to print artwork. The electrotypes could be incorporated along with movable type to compose the forms for printing. It is important to begin this process by opening a family tree on Ancestry.com or one of the other large online genealogy websites, so you can begin to have the benefit of their record matches and hints. Remember to closely examine all record hints to make sure they apply to the people you're researching. Above all, look for consistency in the dates and places. Also note the occupations, because this will help in dealing with people with the same names. According to the 1950 U.S. Census, the Buckners were living at 1122 5th Street Northeast in Washington, D.C. Here's a screenshot of that location as it looks today from Google Maps Street View. When you begin a family tree on any one of the online genealogy websites, the record hints may not help immediately. You may have to do some basic research to get enough information for the websites to begin their own searching. City directories are a useful help for adding additional information to what is recorded in the U.S. Census records. In this case, Sam and Rose Buckner appear in the 1954 Washington District of Columbia City Directory, living at the same address. This entry also agrees with and supports that he was working for the government printing office as a plate maker operator. A search of the 1950 U.S. Census for Buckners living in Washington, D.C. does not immediately show any possible relatives nearby, but they might be living near Sam Buckner's wife's family at this point. We do not know her maiden name. Migrants usually settled near relatives and friends from the place of departure, but those young people who left the South during the Great Migration often acted as individuals in communities formed only over time. If I were doing this research for one of my own ancestors, I could contact my own family for some or much of the information I needed to get started. But I do find that it is not uncommon for people to have drifted away from their family and that information about their grandparents is not known to them. With the addition of this one record, Ancestry began finding record hints. Sometimes it is a good idea to add in information that is found even when you do not yet know if the information is accurate. You can always back out and delete any information that turns out to be unreliable. All genealogical research is a work in progress and subject to change with the discovery of additional records and information. Another record from the U.S. Public Records Index, 1950 to 1993, Volume 1, has a name and a birth date of 19 October 1919 for Sam Buckner. He was still living in 1985. In some cases, Ancestry will add the new information to your family tree, but check to make sure all the information you find gets entered properly. Don't be surprised if birth dates and names start to change as recorded on newly discovered records. Also, at this point, it is evident that there are a lot of people named Sam Buckner. Although telephone directories have almost completely disappeared, for the years that they existed, they are an additional resource. Sam Buckner was found in U.S. phone and address directories in 1993 to 2002 at the same address. A World War II draft card for Sam Buckner dated 16 October 1940 showed his birthplace and father's name as Marion Buckner. He was born in Sumter, South Carolina. This record has a birth date of 12 September 1916. The card indicates that he was working on his father's farm. Although there is a discrepancy in the birth dates, it is possible that the previous Public Records Index was referring to a different person. This date is also inconsistent with the calculated date in the 1950 U.S. Census, but it does narrow the difference between Sam and his wife's calculated birth date. Marion Buckner, the person who appears to be his father, has a number of possible records, including a 1920 U.S. Census record. This record shows that his wife in 1920 was named Anna Sanders. He apparently had a second wife named Evola or Erola Buchanan, as shown in the 1930 and 1940 U.S. Census records. There is also an 1880 U.S. Census record for Marion giving his parents' names as Henry Buckner, born in 1851, and Patience, born about 1855. An 1870 U.S. Census record shows that Patience's maiden name was Spann. We are now back to people who were born into slavery. At this point, the connection between the Sam Buckner in the 1950 census and the Sam Buckner who appears in the records referring to a Sam Buckner in South Carolina is tenuous. More research may confirm the conclusions made so far, or I may not have connected to the correct family. I am missing a marriage record for Sam and Rose Buckner, and I am also missing a maiden name for Rose. Sam Buckner apparently dies in Sumter County, South Carolina, according to the usnewspapers.com obituary index, 1800s to current. Learning about the Great Migration continues. There is really no end to the research that can be done and the discoveries that can be made. There are always more records. The next video, number 3 in this series, will continue to research about a family beginning in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Thanks for watching.